Well, good morning. This is the U.S.-China agricultural trade and shifting consumption patterns in China FarmDoc Daily Live Coronavirus and Ag webinar. I'm your moderator for the day, Todd Gleason. We have a couple of panelists with us today. Wendong Zhang is with us from Iowa State, and Nick Paulson is here. He's an ag economist from the University of Illinois and part of the FarmDoc team. Nick's going to kick us off with our presentations. Good morning to you, Nick. Thanks for being with us, and we're glad to have you here.
And thanks to you, Todd, for moderating as always. Thanks to Wendong for being our guest this morning. So we're gonna kick things off here with the typical intro from the FarmDoc team. Now, last week, if you joined us last Tuesday, we had Joe Glauber as our guest, and he talked about a lot of the background, a lot of the details, a lot of the outlook in terms of the overall ag trade picture for the U.S. We talked about some of the information related to obviously China, the trade war, the Phase 1 agreement that is kind of supposed to be in the processes of being implemented, and where we're at relative to some of those commitments and targets. So I didn't want to kind of redo some of that background information that we looked at last week. A lot of that stuff isn't necessarily new information for anybody at this point. We've been talking about this for quite a while. But one thing I did want to start off by highlighting is fairly consistently when I'm talking to groups about trade and China and trade deals and the trade war over the past year is we get questions about the tariff revenue that is being collected that's associated with some of these trade actions that the current administration has implemented since 2018. And a lot of times that question is asked in kind of a way that suggests, that we need to look at positive aspects associated with the trade war, and the fact that we're collecting significantly more tariff revenue is absolutely true. So if you look here at kind of the history of annual customs revenue, going back over the last 20 years, you see the significant jump in 2018. Part of that year was when a lot of these trade actions were first implemented. And we've got 2019, another big jump relative to historical trends in customs revenue for the full year being covered by a lot of these trade actions. And then the 2020 year, which I would caution against too much in that number at this point, given that's just based on Q1 being converted to an annualized rate at this point, and that'll probably change given the economic and global trade slowdown that we will likely experience with the coronavirus pandemic. But you can see the big jumps, basically a doubling of the customs revenue that we likely would have been collecting in the absence of some of these additional trade actions that the administration is taking on. And the big one being the actions against China associated with the Section 301 investigation, where an expert panel found that there's about $50 billion in annual trade damages associated with China's unfair acts, policies, and practices related to intellectual property rights and technology transfer. So if we just isolate the effect of some of the trade actions the administration has implemented as being in addition to tariffs or customs revenue that we would already be collecting, since 2018, I think the data was through April 22nd, we've collected over $60 billion in trade revenues just associated with the tariffs that have been implemented on washers and solar panels, steel and aluminum, and then the Section 301 tariffs, which are primarily China. A lot of times people will ask the question, aren't the costs associated with programs like the market facilitation program, aren't we just covering those with tariff revenue? It's not exactly how tariffs work. Tariffs are collected and go into the general fund. They don't go into an account that's necessarily allocated for anything specific like that. But just comparing the numbers, there has been tariff revenue in excess of the tariff revenue collected in excess of the $28 billion that have gone out in MFP payments in 2018 and 2019. As an economist, though, I feel the need to remind people, though, that there are additional costs and deadweight losses associated with taxes, which is what tariffs are, And most economic analyses that have been done on the tariffs associated with this trade war have shown that it's not China that's paying the full price of these tariffs. It's mainly being borne by U.S. importers and then ultimately being passed on to consumers. So the next thing I want to do here as we lead into Wendong is we're going to put a poll up. So just curious what the audience's feelings are, what the level of support is for raising tariffs on imports from China, potentially again as a response to the coronavirus. This is something that has been in the news quite a bit the past week. Nothing formally coming out in terms of proposals from the administration as of yet. But definitely something that is being reported on and talked about as ideas in terms of some sort of retaliation associated with trade or in some other way due to the coronavirus pandemic. So give you just a few more seconds to enter in your responses here. Once Jim closes down the poll, we will get the results up to you. All right, and our results are now up. We've got almost half of the respondents strongly oppose additional tariffs on China as a response to the coronavirus, and then about 70% oppose it either strongly or somewhat. So pretty strong feelings from the group here in terms of opposing any additional tariffs on China based on what we've been going through here over the last months with the coronavirus. Very interesting to see those results. In here, I'm kind of going to highlight some of the work that Wendong has done. Last year, he was involved with some other authors on an Iowa State University survey study that surveyed, I think, around 700 respondents from Midwestern states, Iowa, Illinois, and Minnesota. So this is a farmer-based survey. And you can see here, this was done a year ago, but the same question about support for raising tariffs on products imported from China. But back a year ago when we were thinking about tariffs just in the context of the trade war and, again, those intellectual property and tech transfer damage justifications that were used to justify those initial trade actions. So again, interesting to see kind of maybe not obviously we're not surveying exactly the same people, but a shift towards more opposition towards tariffs relative to a year ago to today. Another idea that's been floated, and we're going to put up another poll here. Curious what the level of support might be for some of the other actions, ideas that have been floated as a response to the coronavirus pandemic. As I'm sure many of you are aware, China holds a considerable amount of U.S. debt, and there has been talk of actions related to debt cancellation for some of that U.S. debt held by China as an alternative or potentially additional response to tariffs. As a response to the coronavirus. So again, curious to see what people's feelings here in terms of opposing or supporting a debt cancellation response in this poll. And we'll give people a few more seconds to answer here. All right, Jim, why don't we go ahead and close it out? We had about half of our viewers vote on that one. Results are coming up here in a second. All right, and kind of somewhat surprisingly, I think. Again, the biggest category here, about a third of you strongly oppose that. Almost half oppose either somewhat or strongly, but larger groups in the support camp, at least somewhat or strongly supports some action related to the debt that U.S. debt that China holds. So interesting results there. Well, again, trying to kind of contrast that back to the farmer survey that Wendong was involved with last year. Again, these are a year-old results now. Obviously, a very different time period when people were filling things out. But a couple of interesting questions from that survey work last year. how much concern there is among the respondents about the amount of U.S. debt held by China and whether that poses a serious problem for the U.S. Considerable amount of agreement with that statement in that survey, as well as considerable amount of agreement that China's record of enforcing intellectual property rights leaves much to be desired. So, again, the intellectual property rights issue is kind of the justification for the trade war and the initial tariff actions we've seen against China in 2018 and 2019. And the debt situation is nothing new, and that was kind of a concerning thing within this survey taken a year ago. Last couple of questions I want to highlight before we start to transition over to Wendong's portion of the presentation. Again, a year ago survey looking at what farmers' sense of the importance of a healthy economic relationship with China was. So the figure there on your left shows a very strong agreement with the importance of having a healthy relationship with China. And then on our right, we've got the results related to a statement about China's growing economic strength is good for the world. And a little bit more mixed on that one, with the majority generally agreeing or strongly agreeing with that statement, but a few more in the disagreement camp. So again, just kind of looking at where kind of at least a farm audience, farm survey respondents were at a year ago in terms of opinions on where China was at, where China was positioned, how the U.S. was positioned with respect to China, I think are interesting things to keep in mind as we move on to what Wendong is going to talk to us today about trends and things that are going on in China. And to transition over to Wendong's presentation this morning, I thought we would just do one more poll here. So what is your view on the long-term outlook for demand growth in China? And then the potential for exports of U.S. agricultural products to China. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how we feel about this before we hear from Wendong, and then I think we're going to follow up with this question in our exit survey as well to see if anybody's opinions change based on what we learn over the next 20 minutes or so.
Indeed. So go ahead and fill that out. Thanks to Nick Paulson, who has been the presenter so far, part of the farmdoc team here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. Of course, I'm your moderator, Todd Gleason. If you've got questions, don't forget you can put those in the question box over on the left-hand side of your page in those gray boxes, or maybe down at the bottom, depending on how you've got it set up. And we'll get them answered as we make our way through the webinar today. Most often, people want to know how many people are actually listening and taking the survey. About half of you have taken it, around 350 of you on at this point. And the answer to this survey says that 29% of you say U.S. ag exports to China will decline. 26% think they'll remain stable. And 37% believe that ag exports will increase, and just 8% say they don't know. It'd be interesting to see, Wendong and John, what you think about that survey result. Thank you, by the way, for being with us. Wendong is an assistant professor and an extension economist at Iowa State University. Good morning to you. Glad to have you on board today. Thanks so much for being here. What do you think of that original survey result from the most recent poll?
Yep. Good morning. Thanks, Todd and Nick. Most importantly, I think compared to your previous panelists and speakers before, I have the leverage. I can read a Chinese newspaper. That's probably the only advantage I have to talk about the topic today. It's interesting. I have mixed feelings about this topic as well. I think that China definitely has the potential and capacity to increase the ag import demand from the U.S., but there are through this, especially through the trade war, there are a lot of strategic thinking now China has, which incentivize their strategic diversification away from the U.S., especially when it comes to soybeans. So I will break that down a little bit more later today. So first, I want to give you the update on what is the impact on the Chinese and U.S. economy through the coronavirus. If you follow the news that is pervasive now through both the Chinese and the global news media, that the Chinese economy has seen the first ever contraction in quarterly GDP since the 1970s, late 1970s, since China's economic reform. At the same time, the U.S. economy has also seen a significant reduction, especially for the within the 6 years, and we're probably seeing a greater impact in quarter two compared to China as well. So one of the natural question is, how does this coronavirus impact one of the major momentous phase one trade deal that is signed between the two countries? So I have written a short article. I encourage you to check it out. That it's published about 50 days ago now, but it's some of the major points that still remain valid. That Joe Glauber has talked a lot about what is included in the deal, so I wouldn't repeat the background. I want to give you some more contextual and cultural background, what is the Chinese are thinking. But to recap, if you don't already know, this phase one deal signed on January 15th essentially requires China to buy an additional $12.5 billion more of agricultural products in the calendar year of 2020 relative to 2017 as a baseline. So rather than seeing $20 billion, $24 billion exports, we're expected to see around 35. And the growth relative to the 17 baseline would be even higher. It's in the calendar year of 2021. So in this article, we argue that definitely one of the coronavirus impact is that this created significant delays, so that we argue that maybe whether we count the year one as a calendar year of 2020 will be somewhat debatable. There are both political incentive to say change the year one benchmark, say April or May, then that will cover the 2020 soybean crop season. So, but I think one of the key points I want to talk to you is that later on you'll see China buys a lot of agricultural products from our competitors. So China does have a lot of capacity to do these trade diversions to make things happen. But unfortunately, when you're looking at the actual data, except for pork, that the progress and the growth are not necessarily there in the data yet. So what do I mean by that? Next slide, please. Right. So what we see, there is a general overview by Chad Bound at Peterson Institute. In the blue line, it shows how U.S. agricultural exports to China have grown in reality over time. That is, since China joined WTO in 2001, the annual agricultural exports from the U.S. to China have grown significantly from $2 billion to more than $20 to $25 billion a year, competing with Canada for the top spot every year. And the red line is what is required by the phase one deal. If you look at these comparison, that is beyond even the growth, beyond the GDP growth projection lines, and it definitely has blown all the previous historical numbers, overtakes that, right? So which raised a lot of concerns whether China can make things happen. I would argue that for the 2020 target, China definitely has the capacity, but there are a lot of caveats because the phase one deal said that China will make the agricultural purchases based on commercial considerations and the market prices. And there's another even more worrying phrases saying that both parties believes that the trajectory from 2022 to 2025 will continue as promised in the phase one deal. What happened is that when you are looking at the red dot on the right portion of the graph, that would essentially, if you do a linear projection, we are if you believe that phase one agreement word for word, then you are talking about by 2025, we are talking about over $50 to $60 billion annual agricultural exports to China, which worries people more rather than reassures the market observers. Right. So I think what it makes sense is to focus on the phase one deal is a 2-year deal. More realistically, it's probably the first year is even more important because of the year 2 happens post the election. Regardless of the election outcome, there likely will be renegotiation of the phase 2 that could potentially change the terms for the phase 1 deal. So I also have done some work before on Iowa State's ag decision makers, so I encourage you to check it out. So this provides some more lens that goes into what I'm going to talk about related to Chinese agriculture as well. So when you are thinking about where are the potential growths might be, I would argue that through this phase 1 deal, we may see potentially an increase in U.S. agricultural exports to China. But even if that occurs, we may not see a repeat of what we have been seeing in terms of the composition of what we're selling to China. So this is a little complicated graph, so I apologize for that, but let's focus on the left portion here. This essentially is listing all the key agricultural products that the U.S. is being selling to China. And when you see a yellow bar, that means that China buys a lot from the U.S. When you see a gray bar, that means China buys from other countries. For example, soybeans, China buys about $12 to $15 billion of soybeans from the U.S., but China buys even more from Brazil. So in fact, that China roughly buys 60% of the soybean export from the U.S. in 2017, but the Chinese purchase of the Brazilian soybean exports is 70 to 75%. So I think that after the deal, that we're unlikely to see dramatic increases in the soybean exports to China. Where the gross margins will be is the proteins market in part is because African swine fever, which wiped out 40% of the hog inventory and resulted a quarter of a decline in the pork production domestically in China. And the rising income also led to more per capita beef consumption as well. But in addition, remember that the phase 1 deal also classified wine and beer and infant formulas and a lot of the vegetables and fruits are part of the agricultural portfolio as well. And these will likely increase to become part of the mix. So to summarize, I think that the two groups that will see significant increase in terms of where we'll see a growth in the U.S. agricultural exports would be the proteins, mainly pork and beef and poultry, but also the consumer-oriented products from vegetables to fruits and wine and beer and infant formula. So it's not necessarily all benefiting Midwest states, but we'll see, hopefully this will also be a more balanced portfolio when we are looking at U.S. agricultural trade. Okay. So another thing to keep in mind is that this shows you, because of African swine fever, this is what China has been buying from the global market. Before the African swine fever happened in August 2018, China has been able to produce 97% of the pork domestically. And China used to have half the pig in the world. Now the African swine fever have left them lost about 40% of that. But even when they felt the urge into buying significantly more from the global market, now the amount they are buying is only 5-6% of the Chinese pork consumption. It's still a very tiny portion of what China has been doing. In part is because pork is one of the most important diet for a Chinese citizen. So another thing so that's why they wouldn't want to rely on the overseas market too much. And even when they're buying a lot from the U.S. now, the proportion they're buying from the EU is even more. So when you are thinking about why this is happening, why they're buying a lot more, you need to look at the daily pork prices between the US and China. After the African swine fever, Chinese pork prices have skyrocketed, and that in part has reflected China's consideration when they are looking at where and which commodities to buy. They tend to still pay a lot of attention to whether this is economical and whether this is rational based on the market prices. Right. So similarly, when you are thinking about the soybean exports, in this case, the Brazil representing orange, they're still accounting for a significant chunk that China has been buying. You can see the trade war impacts through here, 2008 and 2019, China buying almost exclusively from Brazil. Now they have recently ramped up the US soybean exports purchase, but still that they're not exclusively buying too much from the US, that they are almost on par with the pre-trade war level, but it's not exceeding that as promised in the phase one deal. So I want to shift gear a little bit to talk about what has changed and what has remained constant before and after the coronavirus. One of the things that remained unchanged is when you are looking at the US and Chinese agricultural production, there's one concept in economics that's very important, is comparative advantage. This is showing you Chinese map overlaying with the lower 48, with Iowa and my hometown in China highlighted, where when you are thinking about that for Iowa, such a north state in the US, we have one of the best soils for corn and soybean production. We have three sides of the country facing the ocean, which receive plenty of precipitation for a profitable production. While in China, there are many places don't necessarily have the comparative advantage, especially when you are thinking about the ratio of the arable land and the number of farmers in China. Things are quite tough. So where Chinese people live, they live in a cyclone-colored area on this map. That I'm from the Shandong province here, which roughly has the same size of Iowa, but has 100 million people rather than 3 million, which is good when you're thinking about the labor for manufacturing sectors, but that also means that all the livestock and crop production are essentially competing with people for this cyclone-colored area as well. That in China, there's roughly 20% of the global population only has about 9%, 7 to 9% of the arable land, whereas in the US, we have only 4% of the global population has a luxury of about 14 to 15% of the arable land, right? So I think the overall, when it comes to commercial agriculture, US still have the comparative advantage that China cannot use the domestic production capacity to be self-sufficient in all the major commodities, right? So in terms of what they want to focus on, in the south, they want to focus on rice. In the middle, they have wheat. Now corn is in the north, is increasingly used for fuel and feed, and soybean they have given up, and pork is in the southern part. So these are some of the commodities they want to focus on when it comes to feed grain. They have essentially increasingly relying on the global market. So another thing, what has remained unchanged is when you are thinking about the meat consumption and the economic growth trajectory in China, the fundamentals are still there. The per capita meat consumption in China are still in an upward growth trajectory. Why pork is so important is because the dark blue shows that pork consistently accounts for about 60% of the meat that Chinese people eat on a daily basis. But I want to highlight this orange bar, which represents beef. You see that over time, that the beef consumption over the last 2 decades increased only as small slices, But that small slices, the 1 pound per person increase over the last 5-6 years, have resulted a dramatic increase in what the beef that China is buying when you multiply that 1 pound by 1.4 billion people in China, and also shifted the Australian beef export industry as well. Another thing that is beyond the commodity we are familiar with is Chilean cherries. That and another similar commodity is avocados. So the avocado imports by China have risen more than 100 times over the last decade, and the Chilean cherries also rose significantly. China and Chile signed agreement. One of the interesting things is that Chinese citizens are getting more income, so the Chilean cherries are larger size than the traditional Chinese cherries. So you can notice this is different. So this is the buyers and consumers are bragging implicitly to the neighbors and friends, saying that I can buy this higher priced imported goods. So these sort of purchase behavior will also happen a lot. So another thing I want to focus on is that when you are thinking about why we still need to care about China after the COVID-19, is when you are thinking about where the next billion middle class there are in the world, 88% will be in Asia, especially 350 million in China and a lot more in India, and 20% of the US agricultural products essentially get sold overseas, and increasingly that the global market is really significant for the US agricultural production as well. And so what has the final factor that I want to comment on is that China continued to do a lot more overseas investment through an initiative that, if you haven't heard of, encourage you to Google it up and find more information about it. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. Essentially, you can think of this as more of a 21st century Silk Road. One of the concrete examples is that if you are a grocery shop owner in inland China, want to buy pork from Europe, used to be that you have to go through south of Africa in a tank to reach your shop. Now, through this rail line, you can cut the travel time from 2 months to 3 weeks. And a lot of the medical supplies are going through this way to the European countries from China as well. So, for the remaining slides, I want to comment a little bit more on what has changed, and then we can go to questions. So one of the things is that before this coronavirus, a lot of people only focused on the benefits and the connectivity of the high-speed rail, but now the coronavirus have highlighted some of the challenges for social governance when the high-speed rails bring more people quickly throughout the country and make the spread of the coronavirus much quicker. Another thing that is in a way is a fortune from misfortune story, that although China lost 40% of the hog inventory, when you are looking at what has lost, it's mainly the smaller scale and somewhat backyard production as well, that all the top 15 public listed firms hasn't got affected by African swine fever. And you actually are seeing a lot more consolidation and modernization, and some of the hog companies who didn't own packing plants now starting to buy a lot of those as well. China used to do a lot of live hog transportation, now is doing more the cold storage and the meat transportation, as we see in the US as well. So next slide, please. Right, so the last slides I have is that even when you are looking at my hometown, things have changed dramatically as well. On the left is that it's my uncle holding his grandson in a greenhouse that in my hometown is roughly in the same latitude as Kansas. For thousands of years, this has been a wheat country, but nobody is growing that in a country now. And on the right is my county top officials just doing essentially an online TikTok live broadcast on a mobile platform to sell the vegetables. And this is saying my home county is now the #1 county in terms of vegetable production. The reason is because now 500+ million consumers shop on mobile phones, and 800 million shop essentially on the online platforms. So you will see a lot of those happening, more happening after the coronavirus. After the 2003 SARS outbreak, the largest e-commerce platform, Taobao, was founded in 2003, right? So last slide, next slide, please. Right. I want to end with 2 slides. One is looking at an article that is by the author who wrote The Brief History of Humankind. I want to focus on this, that he wrote, in this time of crisis, we face 2 particularly important choices. The second choice is between nationalist isolation and global solidarity. One of the impacts is that this coronavirus could create a lot of the deglobalization or localization pressures when the firms and countries want to diversify and shore up the weak points in their global supply chain. But I want to point out, when you are thinking about U.S. agriculture and the Chinese manufacturing, both U.S. agriculture and Chinese manufacturing industries are 2 beneficiaries of the global trade system. So I think in the agricultural community in the U.S. should push for more trade rather than less. One of the, on the right is one of the things that I can show you one example how I get a lot of the news related to President Trump, that this could be one of the news article, it could be a Twitter. I wanted to highlight that now in China, in a globalized world, the Chinese people can get the news from the U.S. A lot quicker than you think. So I want to end the presentation with the next slides with a Chinese lesson. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So first, on the left, it shows you 2 phrases that shows the coexisting and equally strong attitudes when it's the Chinese public towards the U.S. The first one is 美国, is essentially the name of U.S. It's literally translating to a beautiful, so 美, a beautiful country. Okay, so that's the underlying positive attitudes of the Chinese public toward the U.S., evidenced by over 400,000 students coming to the U.S. to study every year. However, the second phrase is also increasingly important, that it shows 中华民族伟大复兴, which is branded as the Chinese dream. Essentially, when you are thinking about the literal translation, is a grand rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. To make it more meaningful for you, it roughly means make China great again. So I want to end with the phrase for crisis in Chinese characters is called 危机. This character 危 meaning danger, and on the right is opportunity. So essentially the word crisis in Chinese contains both danger and opportunity. So I hope that through this we can realize more opportunity and diffuse the sources of danger. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you so much, Wendong. We appreciate you being here with us. If you've got questions for Wendong or for Nick, either one, go ahead and put them in the question box. We'll see them and we'll get to the questions in just a moment. I don't know whether, Jim, we have the next slide with the sponsors or whether we have our poll up next. And let's go with the sponsors. There we go. So our sponsors today, of course, and this helps make the webinar possible, include TIAA, the Center for Farmland Research. That's here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. You can find it at farmland.illinois.edu. Compare Financial and Farm Credit Illinois, both are sponsors, along with the Department of Agricultural, Consumer, and Economics here on campus and in the College of ACES. The Illinois Corn Growers we'd like to thank, and also the folks at Growmark. Coming up in the webinar series, we'll talk about agricultural law issues and the COVID-19 pandemic. That's highlighted right there in Illini orange. The COVID-19 pandemic, of course, has sent shockwaves through the ag production area, and there are all kinds of things that are happening in the legal and law issues area. We'll talk about that on Friday morning. And then if you have signed up for PPP, you'll probably want to know what the eligible uses and the loan forgiveness process looks like. So we'll do that on Tuesday of next week. Be sure to join us at that point. And we'll go ahead and take some questions, I think, at this time for both Nick Paulson and Wendong Zhang. Thanks so much for the questions that you have all submitted. What is China's long-term strategy for transportation? And I don't know, Wendong, if this is in your area of expertise, and what might be the short-term opportunities, I suppose, for biofuel exports. Everybody wants to know if phase one will include ethanol.
Sure. Yep. So I definitely think that phase one first includes ethanol, and China had a ethanol mandate. And they failed to reach that target, but still I think that's part of the long-term strategy, because from China's standpoint, when they're looking at the energy portfolio, China used to rely on coal a lot. Now they're buying a lot from Middle East oil. So what China does is China want to diversify the import portfolio by buying a lot more natural gas from Russia and the US. And also buying more oil from Venezuela and Angola. But also when you are thinking about another part of the portfolio is biofuel and solar and and wind. So these are part of the diversification strategy. That's why China's agricultural policy actually encouraged production of corn for silage rather than corn for grain. So that's part of the growth. Regarding whether this will immediately result in ethanol exports, that remains to be seen. But I think in the long run, China want to build the ethanol plants and import grains and produce ethanol domestically. But to fulfill the phase one deal, it might be easier to just import ethanol at this point. So I do think that's part of the mix.
I keep the Belt and Road Initiative bookmark so I can go back and read it from time to time. There is a question on that. They want to know how much China is investing in Brazilian agriculture or infrastructure. I suppose maybe if you know about Africa as well, that would be interesting to talk about.
Yep, thanks. So one of the interesting part is you need to keep in mind that BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, although branded as the 21st Century Silk Road, does not only just include Middle East and Europe. Brazil and Africa are all on BRI, and Southeast Asia are on BRI. So essentially, it's the overall platform. So China is investing a lot in Africa, building several key rail lines. China has already had a significant footprint in Brazil before the trade war, that for both the Soccer World Cup and the Olympic Games, the Brazilian stadiums are actually built by the Chinese companies. So you can expect that the trade war gives China a lot of the strategic incentive to keep these investments. So that's part of my concern, that my colleague Chet Hart and I think that in the long run, this not 60% of the U.S. soybean exports will go to China, but probably we'll see 45%.
This person wants to know, or has a comment, wants to know, one potential long-term trend that many of us have been considering as a result of the trade war is U.S. trading partners looking to diversify their import portfolios. Do you see this as likely a possibility coming out of COVID?
Definitely. So I think both countries. So from from both the importer and exporter perspectives, there are a lot of urge to look closely at your portfolio from the risk minimization standpoint. From the challenge for the U.S. exports is that China also recognized there is U.S. holds too many other cards in too many other areas. So China has several layers of consideration. One is how much imports relative to domestic consumption I want to get. Two is for all the sources I can import, how many countries I'm relying on. Now I think the trade war, especially now potentially the coronavirus added another layer, is how much share for this particular commodity that is coming from the U.S.
You know, there was a recent Reuters article, and I talked about this on my radio programs because the brokers, of course, and most farmers saw it, indicating significant possible purchase volumes, including 20 million metric tons of corn, 10 million metric tons of soybeans, 1 million metric tons of cotton. Do you think it was correct?
Yeah. So China is so I think it's correct.
Oh, how soon? Will they be able to do it in this calendar year?
So that's remained debatable. Even Senator Grassley is talking about potentially give China some leeway in how to define the benchmark and the timeline. Right? But
how much of a problem is President Trump's current push for more tariffs on phase one?
That probably wouldn't go well with the Chinese public and the Chinese government. One of the unfortunate thing is that through the trade war and through the coronavirus, and on the public spat between the diplomats in both countries regarding the origins of the virus, that the public opinions among both countries have shifted significantly. One of the saying, even since the trade war, is that the Chinese political and business leadership are expecting a bumpy relationship between the two countries, regardless of who goes to the White House next year.
How do consumers feel about the United States, and has that changed?
That has changed in some way. That back in the day, when 10, 15 years ago, when I go to the U.S. to study, that most of the students are graduate students. Now they are undergraduates. They are self-funded, so they have the confidence of the Chinese youth. Now the 20-year-old is way more, and they are more. They're more fluent in English. They watch the U.S. news more, and they are more confident about the growth and the governance styles in China than the previous generation.
Hey, Jim, can you bring up slide 21, what remains unchanged comparative advantage for U.S. ag, where the maps of the United States and China happen to be? Somebody wants to know where the primary growing regions are. I think it's kind of in an arc, but you tell me, and then what commodities they produce. I thought this would be a good place for you to explain that.
Yep. So here, so this one works. So here is the wheat country that. So here is Beijing. Here is Shanghai. Roughly, it's a similar latitude with Kansas. Right? So this is the wheat production area. What's different is that in my hometown area, most people grow corn, wheat, double crops, and in the southern part is going to rice production.
Sorry. We're not seeing your pointer. Jim, can you go to the next slide before that? I think there you go. So I think it runs. Yeah, it kind of runs in this slide. The wheat area is where? Near the star?
Yep. So the wheat area is essentially the star, whereas my hometown is roughly the Kansas area. So essentially natural forces determine where you grow things, right? So here is the wheat area. South part is where the rice is produced. My wife is from the southern part in China, and they also have tea production as well. So cotton is growing in the Xinjiang province in the western part. That's the only major crop that is grown western part of the China. In northeastern part, it's close to Russia and North Korea. It's where the corn and wheat production is. Oddly, there's one spot here. There's a very nice irrigated rice production in the middle of cornfields.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, because they're still, I don't think, seeing your pointer, if you put a kind of a quarter moon in and run from the northwest part of the country in a half moon down to the southeast, that's kind of the arc, if I remember correctly, where most crops are grown. And in the south, they grow more soybeans, but they grow soybeans all the way along. And the northwest corner is corn and wheat apparently in the middle. Is that correct?
So it's to use a 30-degree line, south of that is rice, north of that is wheat. On the western portion, there are some cottons. And in the northeastern part, where it's close to Russia and North Korea, is corn. That's where the soybean is as well. And there's not a whole lot of. So China can only grow 15% of the soybean they needed. So that's why they need to buy a lot from Brazil and the U.S.
So there is a shared border with Russia. What's the relationship with that nation?
So politically, China is in a good political relationship with Russia. So in part, it's so they're buying a lot from Russia, especially natural gas. There are a million Chinese people in the Siberia region actually farming the Russian farmland as well. So there are a lot of investment, but there's the investment. The legal environment in Russia is not necessarily that stable. So there are, but politically, both the two countries are close.
Here's a good question. How might purchase requirements in the current trade deal reinforce or further enable Chinese state-owned enterprises in the long run? So I suppose you'd think about COFCO, Smithfield. Well, Smithfield's not state-owned, sorry, but COFCO in general on the ag side for grains and oilseeds.
Yep. I think that's a good point. And when you're thinking about some of the major structural changes, one of the things that China want to ramp up is storage facilities. That will be a lot of the state-owned enterprises when they try to make these major imports decisions, especially when it comes to grain. State-owned enterprises controls a lot, and through the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of those investments are by the state-owned enterprises as well. When it comes to the livestock importing companies, you will see more actors in private industries as well. So I think definitely there are. Nicholas Lardy at Peterson Institute has a recent book talked about there's a slowdown in the state-owned enterprises. The book is called "The State Strikes Back." It's essentially talking about the resurgence of the influence of the global, the state-owned enterprises in Chinese economy. So I think that point has merits.
Well, on that note, a secondary question that comes from the audience as China begins to increase its middle class, how does it think its citizens will continue to be in agreement with the country's communist system of government? Because some capitalism runs along with democracy pretty well. Does it run along with communism very well?
So when it comes, so essentially the Chinese government made a bargain, right? So the implicit bargain is that I promise you economic growth, you relinquish some of your rights. So far, one of the things I commented when I talked about the Chinese use is there are a lot more confidence regarding the efficiency of the Chinese government system. So one of the political terms talked about is China has a more regionally decentralized authoritarian regime, where in a sense that China has a central government, but what makes the reform work is China says let different lower levels to do different things, incremental experiments, and when certain methods shows promise, they will roll out to other parts of the country. So related to the coronavirus, when you are looking at the Chinese media now, overwhelmingly the Chinese public are applauding the China's control, and after the pandemic, as the cases have slowed down, that my my younger brother are in Shanghai. My parents are with him now, so they have been going out for like over the last 10 days. So a lot of the university will reopen this May. When you are looking at the Chinese public, you have to remember that the Chinese government control information way more tightly. So so in general, the overall support for the Chinese government is pretty high, despite the theoretical incompatibility with the capitalism and the democracy as we know it in the U.S. form. One of the things for sure is that China will not develop into a U.S. or European style democracy. So China will be in its own beast.
Somebody wants to know what your uncle was holding in the greenhouse and how he gets it to market.
Oh, so cucumber. So in my hometown, that's cucumber. And in my hometown area, in the township, there are honeydew as well. So this is essentially because the whole village and several villages nearby are all growing these. So this has become such a big cluster. Essentially, the township and the county help arrange these market sales. So he doesn't have to worry about the market. Essentially, the large companies from large, essentially logistic companies will come in on harvesting seasons and gather like maybe a dozen, even more trucks of these into and sent to Beijing and Tianjin, which is 4 or 5 hours away, which has a large supermarkets. Both cities have 20 and 14 million people, and the honeydews are sent to Japan and South Korea. So the reason why they make this switch is because that back in the day they were growing wheat, and now this income is about $20,000 US. So still not a whole lot revenue, but it's 10 times more than 10 times more when you compare it to what you grow on the wheat field, because there's 1,000 people in my grandpa's village, only 200 US acres to farm. So you don't have a whole lot of land to farm at all.
I'm interested in the mobile marketplace on the phones. Is it auction or is it priced in like a grocery store? Do they work very well? And is there an application in the United States?
So when you're looking at one of the most popular apps in the US, TikTok, it's actually a Chinese company owned that app. So so this one is mainly used as one of the, you can think of this as advertisement. So there are a platform where you can buy directly as well. So essentially these hosts will put up link that you can directly buy online. But it's mainly, you can also reshare the link and make more impact that way. So they're mainly after for the advertisement through this platform, because there are a lot more people checking these videos among the young buyers. And one of the coronavirus impact is there a lot more people are ordering food online and do the delivery to home, contactless delivery online.
We have more than 20 questions left. We're not going to get to all of those, but I would kind of like to go to a speed round very quickly through a couple quick things. Were sales of beef to China growing before the coronavirus?
Yes, mainly from Australia. Income is high.
Is the African swine fever now over or mostly over in China?
Mostly over. So there are some sporadic cases, but they don't have. They're experimenting with a vaccine now.
Does China buy soybeans from Ukraine or just corn? And does it go by rail? By rail?
Yep.
On pork imports, how much and will China increase those?
I think so. Now China buys about 5-6% of the pork consumption globally. So I think that has the potential to increase to 10% if US get. So if US potentially could get a third of that. So it's about fourfold increase compared to the normal year.
How much of the US agricultural industry does China own, if any?
So the most notable ones are the Smithfield and Syngenta. Chinese companies actually don't. There are a lot of the Chinese companies and Chinese citizens are actually not allowed to buy farmland. For companies, I think you will see more.
There was one on dairy. What did they ask?
Is there much demand for dairy in China?
Yes, there you go. Thank you.
Yep. So there's a lot more because back in the day when I was a little kid, that we are not used to drinking milk on a daily basis. Now the Chinese government essentially are mandating for a glass of milk and an egg for every kid in China. If you don't have the money, essentially the government will cover for you. That increased the consumption significantly. The westernized restaurants with pizza and cheese in it is getting more popular. But I don't think that the cheese curds and cottage cheese will probably gain too much popularity in China. I never heard of them until 2 or 3 years ago when my daughter came back home and want to buy cottage cheese. So one of the things to bear in mind with dairy is that a lot of the Asian people, including the Chinese, are lactose intolerant. So you may need to think about what different products we need to bring.
Anything else, Nick, before we let everybody go for the day that you saw that needed to be answered?
Well, there's a question I'm sure Wendong will be happy to answer very directly. What's the downside to the U.S. requesting debt relief as reimbursement for expenses caused by COVID-19? I know I would love to answer that question. That was sarcasm. No, I was being extremely sarcastic there. You're the guest, Wendong. What? You first.
No, I think. Well, I think that probably will cause a lot more political ball kicking between the two countries. That definitely doesn't necessarily work too well for the bilateral relations. But in general, I think when you are thinking about the U.S.-China relations, I want to remind everyone that with the rising Chinese significance, when I look at the Chinese media, there are a lot more negative coverage of the U.S. And the same can be said on the U.S. side as well. So you probably want to balance your information source to get a better picture. And from the extension standpoint, with the significance of the global market for U.S. agriculture, even that now our budget is tight, if I were part of the leadership, we need to hire more people who can understand international market with people who understand India, Africa, and Brazil into the extension system.
Yeah, the only thing I would add on the debt question between the U.S. and China is, it's the faith in the U.S. dollar. I think there would be some pretty significant global reverberations from a tactic like that as a way to address coronavirus. We have had a request for an extended Q&A portion with you, Wendong. My response to that is this is already pretty extended. So maybe one last question. Alternative proteins, plant-based, cultured, fermented. Is there any growth interest in that in China? And we'll wrap up with that one.
Yep. So the answer is yes, because so in China has a significant influence of Buddhism, where the plant-based. When I was a teenager, I actually went to the temples, and there are specialty cuisines. Essentially, as you use mushroom and make it look and taste like pork. So this concept is very familiar to China. To Chinese customers. However, I want to remind everyone that China has 1.4 billion people, and the income profiles, the income inequality is quite significant. When you are thinking about who are buying these products, these are the probably top 1%, top 2% of the people, which is still significant. But the regular Chinese folks are still more worried about African swine fever. And they are not even the consumer of the U.S. imported beef or pork yet.
All right. Well, Todd, I'll let you take us out, but I just want to thank Wendong for sticking with us for extended period today. Great job in the presentation. A lot of questions. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Yeah, Wendong Zhang is from Iowa State University. He is an assistant professor and extension economist there, along with Nick Paulson, who is with us today as a panelist, a farmdoc team member, and agricultural economist from here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. I've been your moderator. My name's Todd Gleason. I work for University of Illinois Extension, and Jim Baltz has been behind the wheel today, the technical director. Thanks to him. We'll be back again on Friday morning. Thank you so much. And again, you can find this as an archive at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu. Have a good day.
Thank you.